Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Today on CityCast Denver, 2 things are true about many Denverites. 1, we love our hot springs. And 2, we sure don't need our electricity bills to be any higher. Which is why Governor Jared Polis' new push to develop geothermal energy across the state is kind of challenging. So today I'm talking to 2 reporters from the Colorado Sun about whether there's enough hot water to go around. Today is Monday, March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. I'm Paul Caroli, and here's what Denver's talking about. Parker Yamasaki and Tracy Ross, welcome to CityCast Denver.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So I want to start with the big picture here, Tracy, and I think that's a question for you. Why is Governor Jared Polis so excited about geothermal energy?
Well, I think this goes back to his whole Heat Beneath Our Feet initiative and the state's, mandate and these big efforts that the state has been making for the last several years to turn toward green energy and, solar and wind and all that stuff. And I think geothermal is just another piece of that. And in some ways, as far as I understand it, geothermal is more reliable. So you have, wind and solar, they rely on wind and the sun. And it has always sounded like the mechanisms that make that stuff work, they break down, they have to be replaced, all these different things. And as far as I understand geothermal from talking to, the 2 developers down in Chaffee County, drilling one shallow geothermal well, that can produce energy for 75 years. And so I think that just taking all of the resources that we can in Colorado and use them toward our carbon emissions goals is really like the big picture. And then geothermal, we just have a lot of geothermal potential here in Colorado. And so it's been a push to do that.
Well, I was wondering about that. Like, what exactly is the potential? Because I was reading about this, and apparently Iceland fulfills like 87% of its demand for hot water and energy through geothermal. Is Colorado anywhere close to that?
I don't think so. I know that, down in the Mount Princeton area, there is a lot of geothermal there. They're on this rift. They're able to drill down deep to get to these reserves. And then Colorado has some projects that, they've been working on that have been in existence for a while that are powered by geothermal.
So those guys and Mount Princeton, we will talk about more in a minute because that's a really interesting project. But I want to ask you, Parker, a question about Polis and his allies because they're working on this new bill at the legislature this year. You've been covering this. It's supposed to streamline the regulatory process. Tell me about the debate at the Capitol.
Yeah, so one of the things that you just brought up, I think, is worth mentioning, and that is what is the potential of Colorado's geothermal resources. Part of what's hard to understand about the potential right now is there's a really high upfront cost for that research. And so some earlier legislative efforts were created to provide grants and provide incentives like tax credits so that developers could come in and sort of figure out what the potential
do some surveys
is, right?
Or like...
Exactly, yeah. And so a lot of that stuff is still ongoing. So, we are definitely not Iceland. We're not a volcanic island.
Right.
But I think the 2 main things that Polis and the legislature are looking at right now as hurdles to geothermal are money, so that upfront cost, and then regulations. And so what they're trying to do right now is streamline that regulatory process. Like you said, House Bill 1165, that's the one I was looking at most recently. Mm-hmm. That was really created to sort of clarify the language around which government agencies, which state agencies distribute permits for big geothermal projects. And so right now it's a little bit unclear whether a geothermal project will go to the Energy and Carbon Management Commission, which used to be the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission until it was kind of overhauled in 2023, or if it goes to the Department of Natural Resources. So the bill itself is sort of trying to clarify which agencies permit which projects and that sort of stuff.
This just sounds super confusing. It sounds like
Right.
It sounds like in Colorado there isn't really anyone who has already done this, like stuck a big, I don't know, pipe in the ground and started pulling up hot water or however it's made. So like these operators are trying to set up these plants and they're trying to figure out regulations. It's all a whole brand new thing. But I want to talk about the pushback, because that's where this gets interesting, and we get this whole push for geothermal starts to butt up against this other thing that Coloradans love, which is our hot springs.
Yeah. So at the last House hearing for this bill, I should say it's still in the House. And so it's still, making its way through the amendment process. We haven't gotten our...
Long way to go.
All right. Yeah, we've got a long way to go. The last time they met, some owners of hot springs showed up to give their testimonies as to their worries. And so because this is sort of I don't want to say boring, but it's kind of just a languagey bill. It's not opening up a bunch of money. It's not doing anything like that. It's sort of just clarifying things.
Mm-hmm.
The hot springs operators wanted to get in there and make sure that they were being protected should any developers come in and, start drilling down near them, because, they are pulling the same resource that geothermal developers would want.
Explain that. What are they? Like, what exactly are we talking about? Is it the same hot water that I'm out there, putting myself in that the geothermal people are? Okay.
Totally. Yeah. And that's part of what's a little bit complicated here is that some of the hot springs operators, like I think it was Kevin Floor of Glenwood Hot Springs, was talking about the fact that their hot springs pull from an aquifer. That aquifer is fed by a bunch of different, feeder sources, and those haven't been completely mapped out. So, if you have a geothermal developer pulling water up from an aquifer, even if it's 5 miles away from the hot springs, it could still be the same source that is feeding Glenwood Hot Springs or Iron Mountain Hot Springs or Mount Princeton Hot Springs, some of these spots that we love to go to. And that's sort of what they are trying to ensure they have protections for. Are
those the ones that showed up? Because those are some of my faves.
Yeah. Those 3 operators showed up and put in their 2 cents.
What are they saying exactly?
Well, I should be clear, they're not against geothermal energy, right? There is a lot of opportunity for development, and they've never said, I talked to Steve Beckley, who's the owner of Iron Mountain Hot Springs, and he's very for geothermal energy in general, just as long as it doesn't suck his hot springs dry.
Yeah, he's got an electricity bill the same way the rest of us do, but not in his backyard, I guess.
Exactly. And so what they just wanted to make sure was that, one, that they would be alerted if there were any developers that, wanted to come in and drill into the same aquifers that they use. 2, they had talked about shifting the burden of proof onto the developers to show that those developers aren't going to damage the hot springs. Whereas right now, I think as it's written, the burden of proof is on the hot springs operators to show that, this potential developer would damage them. And there can be a lot of big costs with providing that burden of proof. And so they just wanted to make sure, one, that they had assurances from the state that developers, as they are incentivized and welcomed into the state, that they wouldn't suck dry, one of our other great assets, which are the hot springs.
Mm-hmm. It's all about money. If you shift the burden onto the energy developers, then it's going to be a little more expensive for them to set up these plants. And who's going to pay the bill at the end of the day, I guess, is the question.
Always the question.
This episode is brought to you by Denver Health. Not sure if you need urgent care or the emergency room? Denver Health has you covered. For non-life-threatening issues like minor injuries, abdominal pain, and even stitches and x-rays, Denver Health's urgent care is your go-to choice. Just walk right in. No appointment needed. With 4 convenient options, including adult care, pediatric care, virtual visits, and a downtown location at 16th in California, Denver Health makes it easy to get the care you need when you need it. But remember, if you're facing a serious life-threatening condition, head to the emergency room right away. Like seriously, like right now. Like if you're listening to this podcast and you need emergency medical help, you have my permission to hit pause and call an ambulance. Urgent care is here for those unexpected issues that need quick attention but aren't emergencies. Plus, Denver Health accepts most insurance plans. Please turn off this podcast right now, call 911, and then go to the emergency room. When you're sick, think Denver Health Urgent Care. Most major insurances accepted.
This episode is sponsored by Babbel. Are you holding back on foreign travel plans this year because you're afraid of the language gap? I'm not, because I have Babbel. I'm David Plotz, the CEO of CityCast, and I'm learning Spanish on Babbel, getting ready for a trip to Mexico City. Babbel is the language learning app that gets you talking. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons, handcrafted by over 200 language experts, get you to begin speaking your new language in 3 weeks or at whatever pace you choose. Babbel's tips and tools are inspired by the real-life stuff you actually need when communicating. With a focus on conversation, you'll be ready to talk wherever you go. Babbel has given me great lessons on getting directions, ordering in a restaurant, and making plans. And of all the things I'm doing in Mexico City, I'm probably most excited about the soccer game we're going to. So I was excited to learn how to cheer from Babbel. That'll be me you'll hear yelling, "Fuerza Tigres! Fuerza Tigres!" With over 16 million subscriptions sold, Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by a 20-day money-back guarantee. Let's get more of you talking in a new language. Babbel is gifting our listeners 60% off subscriptions at babbel.com/citycast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/citycast. Spelled BABBEL.com/citycast. Babbel.com/citycast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
So that's a good time to switch back to you, Tracy, because you have been following one of these projects specifically down near Mount Princeton. It sounds like there's a project, maybe the furthest along in the whole state. Now, Mount Princeton is the 14er on 285 outside Buena Vista. One of my favorite hot springs is there, the Mount Princeton Hot Springs Resort, one of the more built-up spa-like ones. But Tracy, this project, this promising geothermal project, tell us about this.
Well, first of all, I would say that maybe calling it promising might be a little hopeful. Okay. And I say that because I talked to Fred Henderson just this morning, and he is one of the developers. And he and Hank Held have been working on this thing for 15 years. And when I talked to Fred this morning, he was just a little bit sad, I would say, because he's getting ready to leave the state. And he told me that, well, these guys have gotten a lot of pushback from a local community in that area who, once their plant was built, so they would have to drill their well, right, to get to the water. And then once the plant is built, it would kind of block the view of this one community of Mount Princeton. And so they're making a really big deal about that, understandably, but also they have other concerns that are a little more serious than that. There are over 1,900 private wells within 5 miles of the current proposed site.
So those private wells, is that like people's own personal hot springs, like in their backyards or something? Or what is that?
No, that's their home water, their wells, like to drink, their drinking water.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so, they're worried that if something goes wrong with this project, it could impact their water. And they're also worried that because the project is on a fault line, that drilling it could cause an earthquake, which could be catastrophic for them, or at least really bad. And they're also, they're worried about their property values, and they're worried about their quality of life. So, they're worried about noise pollution and stuff like that. And so that's kind of some of the pushback that they have had. That's, different than regulatory stuff, obviously, but it's a big deal. Like, this is a pretty energized group. This is just this thing that's ongoing between this group and the developers, even though the developers, they got a $500,000 grant from the state. They got $1 million promised investment from some developers from Iceland, actually. And so, they've got the money to move toward proving their site. But at the same time, Fred told me this morning, they don't actually have the money, so they have to go through all of this regulatory changes and this pre-permitting process just to get going on, getting to prove their site.
So this debate at the legislature really will affect their prospects if this regulatory process is streamlined or not.
It could, yeah. And, like I said, it's either money or regulations. Those are the two roadblocks. And Governor Polis has been pretty bullish lately on what a streamlined regulatory process we have here in the state. And so if they're able to actually do that, it could, it could be more promising for these bigger developers.
Tracy, tell me about the dream that these guys have for this plant.
Their sort of big dream is to be able to generate this power that then Tri-State can kind of tap into and make it like a reliable source for 75 years of geothermal in that area. So that's their big dream. And, for Fred, it's funny because he's a miner by trade, Harvard educated miner. And so, he's in extraction, like that's his background, but he's really concerned about the future in terms of climate change for his children and his grandchildren. And he's talked about them a lot and, just said like this will help them. And that's deep down inside him, I think at his age, right? He's not going to benefit financially from this. And it's a dream that he would like to see come to life and be realized. But, he's really pretty up there. And I think like he's looking back on his life and he's looking at what his value is now and all the experience and work that he has done so far. And he wants to leave a positive legacy, and that's green energy.
Yeah, he wants to build this thing. Tracy, I have to say that kind of existential angst about the climate and the changing planet, in my experience, that can be soothed with a nice relaxing dip in a hot springs. Has he tried that? Have you heard him talk about that at all?
About soaking? No.
Yeah, about Mount Princeton. Has he visited? Like, is there any kind of relationship between these people on these opposite sides of this thing?
I mean, I know that they're, every time that I met them, I will say this. Every time that I met them when I went down there to do my reporting, we met at Mount Princeton Hot Springs. We didn't soak. We went and had meals together. And it seemed like the relationship was pretty amicable. But I do feel that there were some sort of undertones of this thing that Parker has actually been reporting on of this kind of tension a little bit between what they're doing and how it could impact Mount Princeton Hot Springs.
Parker, what are they saying when these guys aren't around? What are they saying at the Capitol, the hot springs operators?
Well, it is funny because when I talked to Steve Beckley, again, the Iron Mountain Hot Springs owner, over the phone, he was open to the potential of geothermal. Again, I don't think that they are against geothermal energy. I think they are really just trying to protect their own business interests and protect, hot springs for tourists and Colorado residents alike. But, when I talked to him over the phone, everything was very amicable. We have a good relationship with the Department of Natural Resources. The hot springs owners have been working very closely with the Department of Natural Resources to create an amendment for this bill to make sure that their protections are
Sure.
in the state language. But then, at the Capitol, things get a little more heated and they have to show opposition. And so, I think their stance was pretty clear at the Capitol, which was just don't forget about us. Don't go so full force into geothermal that you forget about the business interests of current Coloradans and try and invite all of this development in the name of clean energy, which, is a really big issue right now, just in general.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But you got to extrapolate, hot springs are a business. There's some really well-developed ones that operate like spas, like Mount Princeton and Glenwood we've talked about. But these places are all over the state and they're all levels of formality and commercialization as well. Like
Right.
some of my favorite hot springs are just holes in the wall on the side of a mountain. So I'm wondering, like, no one's at the Capitol advocating for them, those little holes in the wall.
Actually, there was
Really?
talk about the holes in the wall. Yeah.
the holes in the ground. Yeah. Tell me,
holes in the
who's
ground.
who speaks for the holes, Parker?
These big operators, they were the ones that were able to, drive to Denver and spend their afternoons at the legislature. But they were talking about the fact that some hot springs are on state land or on federal land. And so in the case of those, like, who would be alerted to the fact that a developer wanted to drill a mile from one of those wells? And so I don't think that that's been settled yet. That might show up in one of the amendments that is going to come forth for the bill. But it was brought up at the last discussion. And the idea was that, well, at the very least, the state needs to be alerted to the fact that someone is going to drill near these holes in the ground, as we'll call them.
Interesting. I'm just imagining some far future where, like, Polis gets his dream, where geothermal is developed to the full extent that we have the resources for it, and then it's powering our grids and everyone's happy, paying for cheaper energy. What happens to the hot springs? Like, do we lose some of those holes in the ground? Is it harder to operate the resorts? Like, is this a zero-sum game, or is some coexistence possible?
I want to believe that some coexistence is possible. And since we talked about Iceland a few times, I will bring up the example of Iceland. People go to Iceland for the hot springs, right? It's a huge tourism pull for people. And of course, they have this resource in abundance. But, there are hot springs everywhere in Iceland. And it's also run almost entirely on geothermal, right? And so there is some coexistence there. If anyone's ever visited the Blue Lagoon, which is like the really big, like, sort of the photograph of Iceland hot springs, if you've ever been there, it's an incredible experience, but then right next to it is like a geothermal plant. And so you're like in this incredible volcanic nature in this hot spring, and then you just walk around the building and there's a geothermal plant there. And so I do think that these things can run in tandem with each other, but it's going to take some wiggling around to figure out how they actually coexist and to make sure they're not pulling from each other and working together.
Interesting. And I guess that's the debate they're having right now at the Capitol.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, the other end of that same spectrum, Iceland sounds like the picture of coexistence, is Japan, where they have a long history of onsen, hot springs, a tradition, very popular. And because people love it so much, the country has not really taken advantage of the geothermal resources they have. So I guess I want to end up there. Like, where would you expect Colorado's going to settle on this, knowing the politics like you two do, knowing the developers, the business interests? Tracy, what do you think? Where on the Iceland-Japan spectrum are we going to be?
Well, I'm actually hoping that we end up like Idaho. That's where I'm from. I've spent a lot of time in the hot springs there. And, there are hot springs near Boise, and they warm more than 5 million square feet of residential, business, and governmental space through direct heating systems. And yet, at the same time, Idaho has, is a state with like one of the most hot springs anywhere of any of the states. And so it also has a lot of really amazing wilderness. So, you can go into the Frank Church Wilderness and you can do a river trip and you can be in the most incredible hot springs in the world. And then you can go to Boise and be in a place where they're used to do, what they're doing in Iceland. So I feel like Colorado is like Idaho in that way, that we have all these incredible natural places and these beautiful natural resources and wilderness. And, why not let Idaho be our model and try to do both?
Parker, how about you? What do you think? Where are we going to end up?
I'm optimistic. Just like as a general disposition, I'm pretty optimistic. And so I'll go further toward the Iceland spectrum. I do think, the clean energy push at the Capitol has been heavy-handed, rightfully so or not, depending on who you ask. But like there is undoubtedly a huge push toward figuring out our clean energy future, right? And so I do think that they are doing the right thing right now by getting ahead in terms of regulations and protections for hot springs. So like a major utility scale geothermal developer has not come into Colorado yet. That's kind of what this Mount Princeton could have been, might be. So the fact that they're already talking about what could happen to hot springs before any major developments have happened, I think they're sort of in the right spot, and they just need to make sure they keep talking about those protections as they invite geothermal in.
Interesting. Well, Parker Yamasaki, Tracy Ross, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And we would love to know what you think about this debate too. If you're willing to get yourself in a little hot water, should Colorado develop geothermal energy at the risk of harming our beloved hot springs? And which hot springs would you most want to protect? The Hot Water Big Savings Hotline is open at 720-500-5418. Leave us your name and your neighborhood in a voicemail or a text at the Hot Water Big Savings Hotline at 720-500-5418. That's all for today here on CityCast Denver. If you enjoyed the show, why not take a minute to tell Iron Mountain Hot Springs owner Steve Beckley about us, rate the show wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to our morning newsletter and learn more about us at denver.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. See you then. What's the first word? But hey, I want to know what you think. But hey? Hey, you, listener. Hey.